Let's talk climate change. When you consider this global challenge, what sources of greenhouse gas emissions come to mind? Maybe it's livestock, energy and agriculture, land use change, or deforestation? Well, actually, all of these sources are major greenhouse gas contributors. And did you know that each of these sources is strongly linked to agricultural production around the world? At first glance, that list might appear overwhelming, but it gets easier if we begin by looking at the overall greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture. Agriculture alone contributes between 14 and 18.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture's share of emissions is even higher when we consider forests and grasslands that continue to be converted to farms and ranches. Producing food emits carbon dioxide and other powerful greenhouse gas emissions, including methane and nitrous oxide, all of which worsen climate change. How to tackle this issue? In this lecture, we can help you to play a role by learning about the main sources of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and their impacts on climate change. You will also learn about the trends in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions over time. Livestock is one of the largest contributors to agricultural emissions. What does meat production have to do with the climate? Well, let us begin with cows. The main culprit, methane. Cows and other ruminants like sheep, goats, buffalo, and other animals with hooves emit methane when they digest grass and other feeds, a process called enteric fermentation. In the US, enteric fermentation in livestock produces 70% of total agricultural emissions. Cows are the most common form of livestock and produce the greatest share of emissions. Globally, cow digestion is responsible for an entire 1/3 of total anthropogenic methane emissions. Not only are ruminants responsible for emitting greenhouse gases like methane during digestion, but producing all of that corn and other crops to feed livestock also releases greenhouse gases. For example, in the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizers and in converting grasslands and forests that previously stored carbon to cropland. Rice that is grown in water-soaked paddies is another major source of methane. In total, livestock and rice production cause more than 50% of the total global methane emissions. Looking closer, what about all that waste from livestock? Well, manure management is another major source of emissions. The breakdown of manure contributes around 9% of total agricultural emissions globally. Whereas pigs and chickens contribute to this figure, cow and other ruminants' waste are responsible for the largest share. That is 7% of total agricultural emissions. How is manure stored on large livestock farms explains much of these emissions. Storing cow and pig manure in liquid lagoons produces methane and even the stronger greenhouse gases, including nitrous oxide. Similar to methane, nitrous oxide is a strong greenhouse gas, much stronger than carbon dioxide. However, unlike methane, which has a short lifetime in the atmosphere, nitrous oxide persists for many years in the atmosphere. Let us now move on to energy use on farms and getting food from our farms to our tables. It is helpful to begin by identifying the main sources of energy use in agriculture. We will break it down here. When you think about energy use in agriculture, what types of activities may come to mind? Maybe farm machinery, crop production, livestock management, irrigation pumps, or how about heating greenhouses, animal shelters, or manufacturing and applying fertilizers? In fact, all of these sources are major contributors to agricultural emissions by emitting greenhouse gases. Well, why? Well, industrial agriculture uses fossil fuels like natural gas, coal, and fuel oil and farm machinery like tractors and irrigation pumps. It also uses fuel in heating greenhouses and livestock barns. In total, energy use on farms is responsible for 22% of agricultural emissions. This means that when thinking about the energy sector and emissions, we need to think about beyond power plants into farms. Looking deeper, between 1990 and 2018, global greenhouse gas emissions from energy activities on farms increased by 25%. While energy use on farms varies from country to country, an overall upward trend is clear. Stepping off the farm, equipment used to process food, like converting apples to applesauce, as well as packaging and refrigerating food, significantly contributes to the agricultural industry's carbon footprint. Eat local is often the slogan used to promote food that is healthy for people and the environment. Although eating locally produces food has a lot of benefits, including the food is fresher, it supports local farmers. However, the transportation is a relatively small percentage of food systems emissions. The journey of food from the farm to the table is responsible for around 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions from food production.
Next, we will discuss the contributions of deforestation and land use change to agriculture's emissions. To begin, what is land use change and how does it relate to agricultural emissions? Land use change can be broadly defined as the way in which we manipulate natural landscapes like rainforests and grasslands to service human activities. However, within the context of global agriculture, land use change typically refers to the processes by which these landscapes are converted into usable farmland. You may be asking yourself, well, why is this a problem? When these natural landscapes are converted into farmland, the carbon that was previously stored within the surrounding trees, brush, and soil is released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane, among other greenhouse gases. All told, land use change accounts for approximately 43% of all agriculture-related emissions. You may be wondering, what are some of the sources of agricultural land use change emissions? The majority comes from deforestation, which is a process that involves purposefully clearing large swaths of forest land for alternative uses. Globally, agricultural expansion is responsible for 90% of all deforestation, with half of this converted land being used to grow crops and the remaining 40% being used to raise livestock. The loss of these forest lands can be particularly problematic because of the role they play in sequestering atmospheric carbon. What do we mean by this? Well, many of these forest lands act as carbon sinks, meaning they absorb more carbon from the atmosphere than they release. Therefore, when these forest lands are cleared for agriculture, not only is the carbon that was stored released into the atmosphere, but the land also loses its capability to draw in or sequester carbon from the air. As a result of this double burden, many international research organizations have tried to introduce policy changes that would allow us to better monitor and regulate deforestation. This is particularly true in South America and Southeast Asia, where deforestation has been rampant in response to the growing global demand for beef. What are other sources of agricultural land use change emissions? Well, in addition to the agricultural land use change emissions that are attributable to deforestation, another 18% comes from the draining of wetlands. This is a process that involves carving ditches in the land to collect and transport water out of wetlands so they can be converted into usable farmland. As was the case with forest lands, wetlands also serve a variety of important ecosystem services, one of which involves supporting carbon-storing vegetation. Fires account for the remaining 12% of agricultural land use change emissions. These emissions are a direct consequence of burning soil and vegetation to clear land areas for agricultural use and have become particularly problematic in recent years as fire regimes have become more frequent and severe. To wrap up, as we've discussed, agriculture is a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. In this lecture, we have identified the primary sources of these emissions, namely livestock, energy, and land use change, and the mechanisms through which they contribute to this problem. However, as we've suggested, agriculture may also be viewed as a solution to climate change. In particular, researchers within the field of sustainable agriculture have created a variety of integrated mitigation frameworks that illustrate the actions that different actors along the food system can take to draw down the sector's emissions. More specifically, these frameworks point to the roles of producers, politicians, and we as the consumers in creating this change. How can you help reduce emissions from agriculture? Well, here are a few suggestions. Consider the sources of your food and the emissions associated with your consumption of food groups like meat and dairy. Check out the calculators on food sources and emissions linked in this course module. Consider adopting a plant-rich diet and tracking your meal's emissions. This might look like setting goals to reduce emissions in the various types of food categories you consume. Advocate for sustainable policies to be created. What might these entail? Consider how land in your home and abroad is used and share and help support legislative action that reduces emissions and strives for environmental health.